What if Jon Snow went south with Ned? The Goldcloaks turn on Ned Stark in the throne room, but this time there's a trained swordsman already in the Red Keep's yards, and he cuts his way to Arya before anyone can stop him. Ned dies anyway. Jon doesn't. That's not a rescue story. That's the whole war changing shape. Let's get into it. The great hall was loud with the wrong kind of warmth. Southern laughter, southern wine, benches packed with the king's men where Stark men usually sat. The torches guttered in the draft off the doors, and above the high table Robert Baratheon was already deep in his cups, one arm around a serving girl, roaring at some joke of his own making. At the far end of the lower table, Jon Snow drank his ale slowly and watched a family that was not quite his celebrate a departure that would take his father away. Catelyn Stark sat straight-backed beside the empty place where the king had been. She smiled at Robert's men. She spoke kindly to the Septa. She laughed once at something Sansa said, and reached to touch her daughter's hair. And through all of it, across the length of a hall she had run for 20 years, she did not once let her eyes fall on Jon. He was used to it. That was the thing Ned had never fully understood, watching from the head of the table. How practiced the boy had become at not being seen. For 14 years, Catelyn's coldness had been a quiet thing, folded into courtesy, a matter of empty chairs and names not spoken aloud. Tonight, with the hall full and the wine flowing, and the whole north watching its lord ride south, it had nowhere left to hide. Down the bench, Robb was laughing at something one of the king's outriders had said. Arya had escaped the high table entirely and was somewhere near the hounds. Only Jon sat still, at the edge of it, apart in the middle of his own family's feast. A man of the king's party leaned toward him, jovial, drunk. "You've the Stark look about you, boy. Which one are you, then?" The hall did not fall silent, but Catelyn's hand stopped on the stem of her cup, and Jon saw it, and so did Ned. "Snow, my lord," Jon said, "not Stark." The man laughed and moved on, already forgetting. Jon set down his ale. He did not look at Lady Stark. He had learned long ago that looking only made it worse for both of them, and he was tired, suddenly, in a way that had nothing to do with the hour or the drink. Ned watched his son's face across the hall, and felt something old and long buried shift under him. He found the boy later in the cold of the yard, away from the noise, checking Ghost's paws by torchlight, though the wolf plainly needed no checking. "You'll want to sleep," Ned said. "It's a long road to the wall." "I know it." Jon didn't look up. "I wanted to say goodbye to the horses. Seemed easier than the people." Ned had come out here to comfort him.
He had the words half-shaped, something about honor, about the watch, about the men who had worn the black before him. Benjen's name was in there somewhere. It was a good speech. It was the speech a father gave a son he was sending to the edge of the world for the rest of his life. He couldn't say it. He stood in the cold and looked at the boy's face, Lyanna's face, though only Ned had ever been permitted to know it, and thought of a room in Dorne 15 years gone, and a bed of blood, and a promise he had never once spoken aloud to any living soul. Catelyn's resentment would not stop at Winterfell's gates. It would ride to the wall in memory and sit with Jon through every long night of a life spent guarding old stone against the cold. Ned had sworn to protect this boy, not the North, not his own honor, this boy specifically. And a wall at the end of the world was not protection. It was only a slower kind of exile with a nobler name. "Jon," he said. The boy looked up at last. "You're not going to the wall." For a moment Jon didn't move. Ghost lifted his head. "My lord?" "You'll ride south." The words came low and certain, the way Ned made every decision that frightened him. "With me, to King's Landing. You'll train there, under my own eye, and you'll be my son in a court that's going to need every sword it can find." A pause. "If you want it." Jon stared at him. 14 years of learning exactly how much of Winterfell was never his to want. And here his father stood, holding out a road that led anywhere but the only future anyone had ever offered him. "Uncle Benjen." "I'll speak to Benjen." Ned put a hand on his shoulder, briefly, the first time he had done it in longer than he could remember. "Say nothing tonight. There'll be words enough in the morning." There would be. Behind them, the hall still roared, warm and golden, with the king's laughter, and somewhere inside it, Catelyn Stark did not yet know that her husband had just decided to carry his bastard south into the most dangerous city in the world, and that she would have to be told before the sun came up. She was waiting for him in their chambers, and she already knew. Winterfell was a castle that kept no secrets from its lady for long. "Tell me it isn't true." Ned closed the door behind him. "Cat, tell me you are not taking that boy to King's Landing." She was on her feet, and the fear in her voice had sharpened into something with edges. "Tell me you would not do that to this family, to me. He's my son. He is your shame, and you have kept it under my roof for 14 years, and I have never once asked you to send him further than the yard." Her voice cracked. "Now Robert's court, Cersei's court, and you would parade him through it, wearing your name, where every soul in the 7 kingdoms can see what you did. Ned could have ended it in a single breath. There was a truth that would have silenced her. A truth about a promise and a dying woman and a name that was not the one John carried. And it sat behind his teeth the way it had sat for 15 years. And he did not let it pass them. Not for her. Not for anyone living. The wall is death, Cat. A slower one, but death all the same. I'll not send a boy to it because his face troubles you at your own table. The words landed like a blow. He watched them land. He did not take them back, and he did not defend himself any further, because there was nothing he could say that would not be either a lie or the one truth he had sworn to carry into his grave. Catelyn turned away from him toward the fire. When she spoke again, her voice was very quiet. You have never once told me why he matters to you more than my peace does. In 20 years, not once. No, Ned said, I haven't. She did not answer that. There was nothing in it left to answer. Morning came gray and hard, the courtyard already loud with the business of 2 households leaving at once. Robb found John at the stables, cinching a saddle he had already checked 3 times over. So it's true. Robb leaned against the post. You're really going? Seems so. And I'm to hold Winterfell. Robb said it lightly, but there was weight beneath it. A boy made a lord years before he had thought to be one. His father and his brother both riding away in the same dawn. He studied John's face. Do you even want this? South? The court? All of it? Or is it just Father deciding for you again, the way he decides everything? John's hands went still on the strap. He could have said something easy. Instead, he told the truth, the way he only ever managed with Robb. He's kept me at arm's length my whole life, called me his son, and never once let me call him father. He looked at the leather, not at his brother. Now he wants me close. I know what it costs him to do it in front of everyone. I'm not going to be the one who says no to it. Robb was quiet a moment. Then he gripped John's arm hard, the way brothers do. Then don't get yourself killed down there. I'll not be the one to explain that to Father when he comes home. You'll make a good lord, John said. I'll make a nervous one. Robb almost smiled. Write to me. Tell me what the Queen's really like. She hit him at a run then, all elbows, nearly knocking the wind clean out of him. You're coming. Robb told me, and I didn't believe him. But you're really coming. Arya pulled back and jabbed a finger at his chest. You have to promise me something, right now, before you change your mind. Do I? When we get there, King's Landing, you teach me, properly, not the way Sir Roderick teaches, all standing still and holding your arm just so. Real fighting.
Her eyes were fierce and delighted at once. Promise me.
Jon crouched down to her level. Behind her, the wagons were forming up, the horses stamping, the whole long column of 2 families and 1 king slowly beginning to point itself south. "You'll be a terror," he said. "Your mother will have my head on a spike." "Promise, Jon." "I promise." He tugged the end of her hair. "A proper sword. A real one day." It was a small thing, an ordinary promise between a boy and his little sister in a cold northern yard, made in the last easy morning either of them would have for a very long while. And neither of them could have guessed how much, before the year was out, that promise was going to be worth to them both. The King's Road unspooled south for weeks, and mile by mile the world changed around Jon Snow. The pines thinned and gave way to broad brown rivers and fields heavy with the summer the north never truly got. The nights grew soft.
The people at the roadside grew thicker and louder and stared longer at the great column grinding past them toward the capital. He rode near the front. That was the thing everyone noticed first. Not behind with the servants and the baggage carts, where a bastard belonged, but up near Ned's own banner, close enough that when the hand of the king spoke, his son was near enough to answer. Ned had arranged it without a single word, and the whole column had read the arrangement exactly as he'd meant them to read it. The whispers began before they had even cleared the north. The Hand's bastard, riding at his father's side like a true-born heir. Some found it a scandal, and some found it a curiosity. And a few of the older men, who remembered Ned Stark as a boy, found it something else again, and kept their thoughts behind their teeth. By the time the whisper reached the capital, it had run the same miles, faster than any horse could. The city was already waiting to see the boy the Warden of the North had chosen not to hide away. Jon felt the change in how men looked at him along the road. It wasn't warmth, but it wasn't nothing either. And nothing was all he had ever been handed before. The dwarf found him at the fires one night in the Riverlands, a wineskin in one hand, and no apparent interest in anyone's permission to sit. Ned Stark's bastard. Tyrion Lannister lowered himself onto a log with the care of a man whose body cost him something with every movement. "I've been curious about you. The whole column has, if we're honest. You've given us all very little to gossip over, which, in this company, is nearly a crime against the gods." Jon eyed him. "I didn't think a Lannister would sit at a bastard's fire." "No? We're not so different, you and I, whatever your face wants to say about it." Tyrion drank. "All my life, I have been the thing my father wishes he could forget, and cannot, because I keep turning up at dinner. You've been raised on the same hard bread. It teaches a man to read a room from the corners of it." He held out the skin. "Let me give you a piece of advice, Snow. Take it or leave it here in the mud." Jon took the skin. "Go on then. Never forget what you are. The rest of the world certainly won't let you." Tyrion's smile was crooked and, somehow, not unkind. "Wear it like armor, and it can never be used to cut you. Let them see it hurts, and they'll do nothing else for the rest of your days but
press on the wound. It was the first time in John's life a stranger had told him something true about himself and made it sound less like an insult and more like a gift. "Why tell me any of that?" John asked. The dwarf shrugged and reclaimed his wine. "Because it's late, and you looked like a man who'd actually listen. That's rarer than you'd think." They crossed into the Crownlands under a low, gray sky. And that was where the letter found Ned. He read it alone, at the very edge of the camp, and John watched his father's face go still in a way he had learned long ago to recognize and to fear. When Ned finally spoke, it was quiet, and not entirely to John. John Aaron didn't die of a fever. He folded the letter down small in his fist. Someone wanted the last hand of the king in the ground, and no one thought it worth the telling before I brought my own children into the very same city. John looked toward the towers rising far off in the haze. Closer now, red and vast and patient. "Then we ride in careful." "We ride in careful," Ned agreed. But he was already somewhere else, already turning over a death the whole realm had agreed to call natural. And neither of them yet understood that the man who had sent that quiet warning had just pressed into Ned's hand the first loose thread of the very thing that would, in its own time, unravel every life he had come south to keep safe. The training yard of the Red Keep smelled of dust and hot iron and the river beyond the walls, and Ned Stark stood at its edge with his son and two of the most dangerous men in Westeros. Sir Barristan, Sir Jaime. Ned's voice was flat and formal, the voice he used when he wanted nothing in it read that he had not put there. "My son John, I'd have him trained while we're in the city. Properly. Barristan Selmy, white-haired, plain of face, the finest sword the realm had made in 50 years, looked the boy over the way a smith looks at a bar of raw steel he has not yet decided the worth of. Your son." A pause that acknowledged everything and asked for nothing. "Take up a blunt, lad. Let's see what the North taught you." John did, and in 3 exchanges the old knight's brows lifted a fraction, because the boy did not fight like talent. He fought like discipline. He gave ground when he ought to, kept his guard where it belonged, and never once reached for a strike he had not first earned. "Who taught you to give up a bout you might have stolen?" Barristan asked. "A man who told me a real fight only ends one way if you fight to win it at any cost," John said, "and that it isn't the way you'd want it to end." Barristan almost smiled at that. "I'll take him." Jaime Lannister had come only to be amused. He leaned in the shade of the colonnade, golden and bored, watching the Stark bastard with the look of a man bracing himself for a joke he'd have to pretend to enjoy for courtesy's sake. The joke didn't come. "He fights ugly," Jaime said to Barristan, watching close. "Careful, patient. Not a flourish in him anywhere."
He said it as though it were a criticism. It did not come out as one. There was something in the boy's watchfulness, the refusal to take the cheap win, the willingness to eat a hit rather than land a dishonorable one, that scratched at a door Jaime kept very firmly shut. He had fought that way once himself, a long time ago, before a throne room and a fat king and a name men had learned to spit like a curse. "He'll disappoint you in the end," Jaime said, and pushed off the pillar. "They always do." But he stayed to the very end of the session, and Barristan, who missed little, marked that too. Word spread, the way it always does behind castle walls. Within a fortnight, a small crowd would gather whenever the northern boy took the yard. Courtiers, idle knights, a septon or two, servants who ought to have been elsewhere, all drawn by the pure novelty of a bastard who could actually fight.
The bout that mattered came against one of Jaime's own trainees, a broad Crownlands lad 2 years older and half again as strong, and for a good while it went exactly the way every watching eye expected it to. The boy drove Jon back across the yard, blow after heavy blow. Jon's guard slipped once. A hard swing caught his shoulder and spun him half around, and for one long breath the whole yard saw him stumble, his blade flung wide, his whole side open and undefended. The trainee grinned and lunged in for the finish, and Jon gave him the opening on purpose. He turned inside the lunge the way Barristan had shown him only days before, took the blow across his hip and let it land, hooked the older boy's wrist as he overcommitted, and twisted. The practice sword rang loud across the stones. For a heartbeat, silence, then applause, real, startled, delighted, the kind of sound Jon Snow had gone his whole life without ever once hearing aimed at him.
At the yard's edge, Ned Stark did not applaud. He watched his son stand there, flushed and astonished, in the middle of a court that was already beginning to love him. And for the first time since Winterfell, a cold thought moved slowly through him. A boy no one noticed was a boy no one hunted, and he had just carried this one somewhere very bright and very watched, and could no longer say with any certainty whether he had brought Jon south to safety or led him by the hand straight into somebody's sights. The good days and the hard ones came braided together now, and Jon learned, as he learned everything, to live quietly in both. Sansa found the court to be everything Winterfell had never been: silk and song, and a golden prince who smiled at her across the high table. And in all of that shining new world, there was simply no room for a half-brother whose very name announced aloud the one thing she most wished her new friends would forget. She didn't cut him.
She was far too well taught for anything so crude. She simply arranged never to be near him when Joffrey's circle happened to be watching, and let her eyes slide past him in the corridors the very way her mother's eyes had slid past him for 14 years. Once, in a long gallery, Jon caught her gaze by pure accident and watched her decide, quickly, almost gently, almost sorry, to pretend she had not seen him standing there at all. He didn't blame her for it. That was the worst of the whole thing. He understood exactly what it cost a high-born girl to be seen standing beside a bastard in a court like this one, and so he stepped back into the shadow of the nearest column and let her pass without a word, and swallowed it the same quiet way he had swallowed every other small cruelty of his life. Arya made up the difference, and a great deal more besides. She hauled him out into the city whenever she could slip her septa, down into the fish markets and the mud lanes and the crooked alleys where no high-born girl had any business setting foot, delighted always that John treated her like a person worth his time and not a problem to be married off to some lord's dull son. And he kept the sword promise. In a shuttered little courtyard behind a wine sink the two of them had found together, he taught her the grip, the footwork, the patience, the very same patience Barristan was hammering day by day into him. "You're too eager," he told her, knocking her stick aside for the 10th time in a row. "You want it to be over before it's begun. A real fight is never in a hurry." "You sound like an old man." "I sound like my teacher." He reset her stance with 2 fingers under her elbow. Again, from the top.
She grinned up at him, fierce and filthy and entirely, unmistakably herself. And John understood, without being able to put a single word to why, that whatever else this court took from him in the end, this one thing was his, and that it might one day prove to be the only thing that mattered at all. It was very late when Ned found him still awake. John stood at the window of his small chamber, ghost a pale shape at his feet, watching the torchlight move slowly along the walls below. He hadn't been sleeping much of late. The city did that to a man in time. "You should rest," Ned said from the doorway. "So should you, my lord." Ned came in and stood beside him at the window, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. Below them the red keep breathed its restless nighttime breath. A footstep, a distant laugh, a gate closing somewhere far off in the dark. "There's a thing I've long meant to tell you." Ned's voice was low and rougher than John had ever heard it. "About your mother. About who you are and where you truly come from." He stopped. His hands lay flat on the cold stone of the sill. "You've a right to it. You've always had a right to it. And I've kept it from you longer than I should." John went utterly still. 14 years he had waited for exactly this. A name, a face, one single true thing about where he had come from. He didn't dare so much as turn his head. "Then tell me." And Ned Stark opened his mouth to say the truth aloud at last, and closed it again, because the truth was not a gift. In this city, in this year, with a dead hand freshly in the ground, and yellow-haired children sitting on the king's own knee, the truth was a blade that cut whoever held it, and a boy who knew what he truly was might not yet have the sense to keep it hidden behind his teeth. Ignorance had kept John alive for 14 long years. Ned could not make himself traded away tonight for the mere comfort of finally being honest with the son he loved. "Your mother was a woman I loved," he said instead, very quietly. "I'll tell you all the rest of it when it's safe. I swear it to you, John, on my blood." He left the room before John could ask what exactly wasn't safe about it. And John stood alone at the window with a promise in place of an answer, not knowing, could not have known, that the man who had just sworn to tell him when it's safe had already, without ever meaning to, run clean and completely out of time. The promise sat in him like a stone he couldn't swallow,
Your mother was a woman I loved. I'll tell you the rest when it's safe." Days went by, and nothing in the Red Keep ever once felt safe, and Ned never came back to finish it. And so John did what he had always done with things he wasn't permitted to have. He set it carefully aside, and he watched. He was good at watching now. It had crept up on him.
A year ago, he would have called himself a swordsman and left it at that. Now, the sword felt almost like the smallest part of what the South had taught him. He had learned to hear the shape of a silence, to tell a man who feared the king from the man who feared for him, to notice which lords arrived at a feast, already knowing exactly where they would sit. Barristan had begun bringing him to the edges of the court's smaller business, as part of learning what a white cloak actually did. A petition heard, a feast's seating, the slow shuffle of a council morning. John stood where he was told and kept his mouth shut, and missed nothing. He saw the way the queen and her brother moved around each other, never alone, never quite together. A careful, practiced distance. Two people who took great pains never to be caught in the same empty room. And yet when Cersei crossed a hall, Jaime's eyes went to her without his seeming to choose it, and hers came back to him the same way, and dropped, and neither of them ever said a word about it. John noticed. He mentioned it to no one. He didn't know what it meant. He only knew it meant something. The way a wrong note in a song means something before you can name which note it was. Barristan saw the noticing, and it pleased the old man. "You think the job is the sword," he said one gray morning, the two of them alone in the yard. "It isn't. The sword is what's left over after everything else has already failed." He nodded back toward the looming keep. A man in a white cloak spends his whole life reading a room. Who stands too close to the king? Whose hand drifts toward his belt when a stranger walks in? Where the doors are? What's changed since yesterday? He set a blunt in John's palm. By the time you've drawn steel, you've already lost. The trick of it is to see the thing coming so you never have to. John took to it the way he took to everything since coming south, hungrily, seriously, as though it were the thing he had been built for and never once told about. He began to see the court differently, not as walls and banners and bright silk, but as a room full of men deciding, moment by moment, exactly how much of themselves to let show. He tested it, quietly, the way he tested everything. At a council reception, he picked out the two men in the hall who never once let their backs face a door, and both turned out to be sellswords in a visiting lord's train. He watched Peter Baelish move through a crowd and understood, without anyone telling him, that the man collected people the way other men collected coins, a warm smile for each and a small debt hidden behind every smile. None of it was John's to act on. But Barristan had been right about the heart of it. Once a man learned to truly see a room, he could never again go back to merely standing in one, which was why the fragment caught in him and would not come loose.
2 minor lords in a corridor off the yard, not troubling to lower their voices, because who listens to a squire? They were talking of the royal children. How fair the 3 of them were. How golden everyone. 3 children, gold as a new minted coin, standing beside a father, black-haired as a crow on snow. One of the lords laughed. The other told him to hold his tongue before someone shortened it for him. John had heard the joke before. Half the city told it, in one shape or another, over ale it would deny in the morning. He had always let it slide off him, the way he let most things slide off him. This time, it stuck. He thought of the Queen's eyes crossing a hall to find her brothers, and dropping. He thought of 3 golden children and 1 black-haired king. And he stood very still in that corridor, with a shape assembling itself in his mind, a shape he had no words for yet, and no wish at all to look at directly, the first cold edge of a thing that, once truly seen, could never again be unseen, not by him, not by anyone. He carried the half-shaped thing around with him for days and told no one, least of all his father, who had troubles enough of his own and less time for John now than he had ever had. Ned was gone into the work. Council chambers, private rooms, meetings he came back from grey and silent and unwilling to explain. Whatever it was taking all of him. And into the space he left behind, without anyone once deciding it aloud, stepped John. He walked Sansa to her lessons and stood outside the door until she was done. He walked Arya to the yard and back, and pretended not to see when she slipped his watch anyway. He tracked their small daily movements with the sharpness Barristan had honed in him, counting the exits, marking the faces, learning which guards could be trusted, and which only wore the trust like a borrowed cloak. No one had written the arrangement down. It was simply that the hand of the king was drowning in something, and his son had learned to watch a room, and the 2 facts had quietly found each other and fitted themselves together. Sansa found it stifling. Arya found it an adventure. John found it the first thing in his whole life that felt entirely like a duty and entirely like his own. Once, a drunk knight of the Queen's household blocked their way in a stairwell and made a joke about Ned Stark's whelp playing nursemaid to Ned Stark's daughters. John didn't reach for a blade. He simply stepped between the man and the girls, said nothing at all, and waited. Let the night take the measure of a thing against a boy who plainly was not going to move. The night laughed it off and stood aside. Sansa never mentioned it again. Arya mentioned it for a week. Not everyone's interest in him was so easily explained. John first caught the eunuch watching him at a small reception. A soft, round man in perfumed robes, hands folded, eyes mild, and fixed for just a beat too long on John's face. When John looked back at him, Varys only smiled and inclined his powdered head and drifted off like a curl of smoke. It happened again, and then again. Never a word, never any approach, only that mild, patient study, as though the master of whisperers were trying to place a face he had seen somewhere very long ago, in a portrait perhaps, or the frayed edge of a rumor he had never quite managed to run to ground. John told himself it was nothing. A bastard always drew eyes. But the way the spider looked at him was not the way men looked at a bastard. It was the way a man looks at a lock he is certain he owns the key to, if only he could recall where he had set it down. Once the eunuch spoke to him directly, in passing, so lightly it might have been nothing at all. You have your father's look about you, they say. A pause, feather soft. Though I confess I have never quite been able to see it myself. And then he was gone, gliding off before John could decide whether he had just been paid a compliment or set upon a scale and weighed. John stood in the corridor a long moment afterward, unsettled in a way he had no name for, with the distinct feeling that a door somewhere had been eased open a finger's width, and then just as quietly closed. Ned found his own answer in a book. It was an old thing of Grand Maester Pycelle's, generations of marriages and births set down in a cramped maester's hand, the lines of the great houses running back 300 years. He read it late, by a single guttering candle, and saw precisely what John Arryn had died seeing. House Baratheon, black of hair in every union, every generation, without a single exception across 3 centuries. Black seed drowning gold, always, every time. 3 golden children, Joffrey, Tommen, Myrcella. Not one of them is Robert's. Ned closed the book very slowly. His predecessor had opened this same book and was in the ground inside for a fortnight. He sat alone in the failing light, with the whole crushing weight of it settling onto his shoulders. That he had come south to keep his family safe, and had instead led every one of them straight into the single truth in all the 7 kingdoms, with the power to see them all killed. Ned told no one what the book had shown him. Not the king, not yet. Not even John. He carried it, and the carrying showed on him. And the Red Keep, which Red faces for its living, began to feel the air draw tight, without knowing why. In the yard, of all the unlikely places, one bond was quietly deepening against that current. Jaime Lannister had started pushing Jon harder than any squire he had ever trained. He told himself it was only because the boy was good, and that was true as far as it went. But there was more in it than that, and Jaime was too honest with himself, in this one narrow thing, not to half know it. He watched Jon fight with that maddening restraint, that flat refusal to take the ugly win, that stubborn insistence on being the sort of swordsman honor claimed a man ought to be, and something in his chest turned over. He had wanted, once, to be exactly that. A long time ago, before this city taught him what it actually cost. So he drove the boy. Tighter guards, faster tempo, no quarter given. Again, you're slow. A slow man dies honorably and dies. Again.
One afternoon, he backed John clean across the yard and rapped his knuckles hard enough that the blunt nearly leapt from his grip. John's whole arm gone numb, his guard hanging open. One clean beat from a killing blow had the swords been true. Then the boy shifted his weight off his back foot, the way Barristan had drilled into him, turned inside the next stroke, and cracked Jamie a solid blow across the ribs. A real one, unlooked for. It left the Kingslayer breathing careful for a moment, and Jamie laughed out loud, delighted, startled, in a way the court hadn't heard from him in years. Barristan watched it from the shade and said nothing, but he marked the sound, the way he marked everything, and wondered privately what it meant that the Kingslayer had found, in a Stark boy of all people, something worth being glad about. The story came after, the two of them sitting in the dust with a skin of water passing between them. Jamie didn't decide to tell her.
It simply came out, the way things do when a man is tired and his guard is down, and the boy across from him has never once looked at him the way the rest of the world does. You know what they call me. Not a question. Kingslayer. Man who put his sword through the back of the king he'd sworn to guard. He turned the water skin over in his hands. Nobody ever asks why. Eris had a wildfire hidden under the whole city, under the streets, under the sept, the guild hall, under this very keep. He meant to burn all of it, every man, woman, and child in King's Landing, before he'd hand it to Robert. Burn them all, he kept saying, right to the end. So I stopped him, put my sword through the man I was sworn to protect, to keep 500,000 people from turning to ash in a single night. He shrugged, small and bitter, and I've worn the name ever since. One word. It doesn't leave much room for the rest of the story. John was quiet for a while. Then, I've worn one word my whole life too. Different words. Same feeling. Snow. He didn't need to say it. Jamie looked at him, and for once neither of them said anything more, because there was nothing left worth adding. Cersei noticed. Cersei noticed everything. She found her brother that evening and did not have trouble with warmth. The Stark bastard. You've grown fond of him. She said the word like something spat onto a floor. How charming, and how stupid, considering whose son he is, and what his father's been crawling through Pycelle's books to dig up. Her eyes were very green and very cold. If Ned Stark's little search goes where I think it's going, that boy is nothing to this family but a Stark with a sword, and a fresh reason to use it. Don't make me remind you which side of this you were born on. Jamie waved it off, the way he waved off most things. He's a squire, Cersei, not an
He would remember the conversation far sooner than he expected, and with a great deal more weight than he gave it standing there. Because his sister was rarely wrong about who would have to bleed for the family to keep what it had taken. The truth sat in Ned's chest like a swallowed coal, and he still had not decided how to spend it, when Robert settled the shape of the next several days for all of them.
The king wanted to hunt. He had wanted it for weeks. He hated the Red Keep, hated the council, hated the endless, grinding paper of a realm he had never once wished to rule. A great boar had been sighted in the King's Wood, and Robert Baratheon, fat, restless, sick to death of walls, announced that he would go and put a spear in it, and no argument from council or hand was going to move him a finger's width off the notion. Ned tried. He was distracted, though, his mind 3 moves deep in a game he hadn't yet found the winning of, turning over when and how to lay the truth of Cersei's children before a king who might not survive the hearing of it in the wrong hour. He meant to press harder. He didn't. Robert rode out with his hunting party and his wineskins and his booming good cheer, and Ned let the moment slide past him and told himself there would be time enough to handle the larger thing once the king was safely home again. He had gone to Robert the morning of the ride, meaning to say some part of it aloud. He'd found the king already in his hunting leathers, bellowing for his horse, happier than Ned had seen him since Winterfell. "Come with me, Ned. Gods be good, when did the 2 of us get so old and so dull?" And Ned had looked at his oldest friend, red-faced and laughing and alive, and felt the words die somewhere in his throat. Not today. Not with wine on his breath and a boar spear in his fist. When he was back. There would be time when he was back. Jon saw the change in his father before he understood it. Ned had always been a still man, but this was a different stillness, a held-breath dread, tightly governed, that Jon had never once seen on him. Not when they had spoken, back home, of the things that walked beyond the wall. Not even when Catelyn's coldness had filled a whole hall to its rafters. Something had frightened his father badly, and Ned Stark did not frighten. Jon tried once to ask him. He caught his father alone in a passage, gray and hollow-eyed, and said only, "Father, is something wrong?" Ned had looked at him for a long moment, and Jon watched him decide, again, the way he was forever deciding, not to say the thing sitting plainly behind his eyes. "Keep your sisters close," was all he said in the end. Both of them. Promise me that. And Jon had promised, without knowing what it was he was promising against. He gave Jon more than ever now. Keep the girls close. Keep them in your sight. Don't let Arya wander off. Walk Sansa yourself, no one else. Orders with a hard edge underneath them. Jon obeyed and watched, and felt the ground beginning to tilt beneath a court that still, On its bright surface, carried on exactly as before. The same feasts, the same petitions, the same golden children laughing in the gardens. Only his father seemed to know they were all of them standing on something that was about to give way. The bells told them when it was given. Word came racing ahead of the party. A rider, hard used and shouting before he had even dismounted. The king, the boar, gored open from hip to breastbone, and carried back to the keep already gray, already stinking of wine and worse. And then the bells began, slow, uncertain, spreading out across the whole vast city, the sound of a realm not yet sure whether it still had a king or only a corpse that hadn't finished dying. Ned heard them and went very still, and John, beside him, watched the last of the color drain from his father's face. Because John understood now what all the dread had been for. Whatever Ned had found, whatever he had been carrying and weighing and delaying, the time for delay was gone. The king was dying. And a secret that might have been survivable with a living Robert to wield it, had, in the space of a single boar's tusk, become a thing Ned Stark had only hours left to act on, before the wrong people in this city acted first. Robert lasted the night, which was more than the maesters had promised, and far less than Ned needed. And in the gray small hours, while the king raved and slept and raved again in the next room, Ned Stark set about the work of a man who has counted the odds and does not much care for his own. He wrote to Stannis first, then to Renly, Robert's brothers.
Plain words in his own plain hand. The children are not the king's. The queen has betrayed the realm, and the throne by every law of gods and men belongs elsewhere. He knew exactly what he was setting loose. A letter like that did not end a war. It began one. But the truth was the truth, and Ned had never in his life learned any other way to hold a thing than by holding it straight. And then, in the last dark hour before dawn, with the candle guttering low and the king at last fallen quiet, he wrote a second letter that no small council would ever set eyes on. He wrote it to no one, to everyone. For the first time in 14 years he set down, in his own careful hand, the whole truth of the boy he had raised as his bastard. The tower in the Red Mountains, the promise, the sister bleeding out in a bed of roses, the child she had spent her last breath begging him to keep safe, Rhaegar's son, Lyanna's son.
Not Ned's shame at all, but Ned's oldest and heaviest oath, written down plain at last, because he no longer trusted the world to grant him the time to ever say it aloud. He read it back once, by the dying candle. It was the most honest thing he had set to paper in 14 years.
and holding it there in his hand felt less like relief than like standing at the very top of a long fall, in the last still moment before a man's own weight takes him over the edge. Then he sat and looked at what he'd written and did not know what to do with it. That was the whole trap of the thing. If he revealed what John truly was now, in a city already grinding itself toward war over one empty throne, he would not be protecting the boy. He would be painting a second target across his back, making him a piece in a game with dragons in its bloodline. And if he burned it, the truth died with Ned, and Ned had a cold, strong sense that he might not have long. Neither road was safe.
Neither was even near to safe.
So he did the thing a careful man does when there is no good answer left to him. He chose the least ruinous place to lay the burden down and wait. He sealed the letter with his own wax, and, in the first gray of morning, carried it to the one man in all of King's Landing whose bottomless curiosity and boundless self-interest made him at once the most dangerous keeper of a secret and, perversely, the most reliable. Because Varus never once spent a secret until the spending of it paid. He had considered Littlefinger briefly and discarded him just as fast. A man who trades in gold spends everything he holds the very moment the price comes right. Varus, at least, hoarded. It was thin comfort, and Ned knew it for thin even as he wrapped his hand around it. Varus received him alone, as Varus received everything. He took the sealed letter into his soft, powdered hands and did not ask a single word about what it held. He only bowed his smooth head and promised, in that mild and silken voice, that it would remain quite safe and quite untouched until Lord Stark himself should come to ask for it again. Ned believed him, more or less, and left feeling he had done the one prudent thing still available to a man clean out of good options. He was wrong about the promise, though he would not live long enough to learn how wrong. Because Varys had spent years quietly gathering exactly the kind of fragments a man needs to guess at such a letter, without ever once troubling its seal. A Dornish whisper, a knight's death at a lonely tower, the age of a bastard whose face looked a little too much like no woman Ned Stark had ever been known to bed. Alone in all the Red Keep, the spider did not need to break the wax to know, more or less,
what Eddard Stark had just placed into his keeping. And a secret that Varys understands is never merely kept, it is held and turned and watched until the precise moment it is worth the very most to let it fall. The throne room had never felt so quiet. Robert was 3 days dead and not yet cold in the ground, and Ned Stark stood at the foot of the Iron Throne with a scrap of paper in his hand that named Stannis Baratheon the rightful king, and behind him stood the men Peter Baelish had promised him: gold cloaks, the city watch, steel enough to arrest a queen. Cersei read the paper through once. Then she tore it in half and let the pieces drift to the floor and told the room exactly what she thought of a dead man's will. Ned had planned for that. He gave the word, and the gold cloaks turned, not toward Cersei, toward him, toward Ned's own household guard, the northern men who had come south to keep their lord, dying now in the space of a breath before they even understood they had been bought and sold. Ned wheeled toward Littlefinger and found the little man already pressing a dagger to his throat with something that, on a kinder face, might almost have passed for regret. "I did warn you not to trust me," Baelish said, very quietly. Ned had braced himself for a fight, for treachery even, for a hard afternoon of steel and consequence. He had not braced for this, for the sheer speed of it, for how total it was, for how completely his own honor had failed to imagine a world that could move faster than his conscience did. His men were already dead on the flagstones. The plan was already ash. The whole thing had taken less time than a short prayer. Jory was down. Ned saw that much through the press. Jory Cassell, who had guarded him since Jon and Robb were boys underfoot in the yard, staring up at the vaulted ceiling with a gold cloak's spear still standing in him. 20 Northmen had walked into that room at their lord's back. Not one of them was going to walk out of it. And Ned understood, far too late to be any use, the exact shape of the mistake he had made. That he had carried honor into a place that had none of its own, and that his honor had just gotten every last one of them killed. Half a castle away, in the outer yards, Jon heard it before he understood it. He had been running Arya through her forms. Barristan had folded her into the rotation as a small courtesy, and Jon had quietly turned the courtesy into an hour every day. The sound came to them across the walls, not the ordinary noise of a castle at its business. There was a wrongness threaded through it, shouting with an edge that shouting did not usually carry. And beneath the shouting, faint but unmistakable, the specific bright ring of steel meeting steel that was not any kind of practice. Jon went still. Every lesson Barristan had ground into him lit at once. Read the room. What has changed? He did not need a single soul to tell him. He knew, the way a man knows a storm before the first fat drop of it lands, exactly what that sound was, and exactly whose it was. John? Arya's practice stick had stopped in the air. What is it? Get behind me. She didn't argue. That, more than anything, told her how bad it truly was. At the far end of the yard, the first of them came through. Red cloaks, lions worked on their breasts, moving with the flat purpose of men working from a list. They were checking every face they passed, and on every man they found wearing the direwolf, they did not pause at all. John reached over his shoulder and drew his sword. It was a plain thing, good steel, honest weight, an ordinary crossguard, no Valyrian ripple down the blade, no name, no ancestral ghost sleeping in the grip. Ned had commissioned it for him from the Winterfell forge before they had ever ridden south, and John had trained with it every single day since. In the yard, in the raw mornings, under Barristan's patience, and under Jaime's harder hand, and had told himself the whole while that it was only training. It had never once been only training. He understood that fully now, with the true weight of it settling clean into his palm, and a boy's entire future narrowing down to the next 30 seconds. And he stepped in front of his sister and set his feet and waited to learn whether any of it had been real. The first one came at a dead run, expecting a boy. He found something else. John didn't meet the charge. He slipped it, the way Barristan had drilled into him 1,000 times. Let the man's own weight carry him stumbling past, and opened his throat as he went by. The second was already on him. John took the blow full on his blade, and felt the shock of a real strike jar down through both his arms. No blunt edge, no baited point, no bell waiting to end the bout, and answered it with a short, brutal cut that put the man down and did not let him rise. 2 dead. It had taken less time than it takes to tell of it, and John stood over them with his heart slamming, and some cold, quiet part of himself noting, with a detachment that frightened him worse than the blood did, that every hour of patient instruction and every harder-edged hour of Jaime's driving had just collapsed into this, into function, into use, into a thing his body simply did without pausing to ask his leave. Arya had a knife out, wide-eyed, white to the lips, but not frozen, never frozen, not her. And when a third soldier tried to come around John's flank, she was there at his back, small and quick and vicious, exactly the way he had half promised to teach her, on a road that felt now like another man's whole life.
The fourth was bigger than the others, and better. For the space of 3 exchanges John was losing, driven back on his heels, his guard cracked wide, a blade drawing a long, hot line across his ribs that stole his wind and buckled one knee under him. The soldier drew back his arm to finish it, and Arya drove her knife to the hilt into the back of his leg. He screamed and turned, and John, half blind with the pain of his side, put his sword through the man before the scream had finished leaving him. He came up gasping, one hand clamped to his ribs, red slicking warm through his fingers. Alive. Barely. There was no time to be anything more than that. He would carry the mark of that fourth man for the rest of his life. A pale seam along his ribs that would ache in the cold and pull tight when he reached too far. It was the first wound the South ever gave him. It would not be the last. Far behind them, in the throne room, Ned Stark saw it. He was on his knees by then.
Disarmed, a blade laid cold against his neck, blood in his mouth, the whole ruin of his plan finished and settling around him. But there was a window, high and narrow, looking down upon the outer yard, and through it, for the length of a single breath, he saw his bastard son, sword drawn, bleeding, cutting a hard path toward the gates, with Arya pressed tight to his back, alive, fighting, moving. Ned had spent 14 years unable to give the boy his own name. He could give him nothing now but a look the boy would never see. And yet something in it, Jon alive, Jon shielding her, Jon getting out, put a strange, fierce warmth in his chest, even as the last of his own hope guttered black, and he thought, with the awful clarity that comes to men only at the very end, good, good, get her home. Then the Lannister ranks closed over the window's narrow view, and closed over him, and the throne room swallowed all the rest. Jon and Arya broke into the stable yard, with the whole castle shrieking at their backs. The horses were there. The gate beyond them still stood open. For now, for another moment, for less. And Sansa was there too. She stood frozen in the middle of the yard, in a gown sewn for a feast, penned in. Joffrey's household guard on one side of her, closing. The open gate on the other, closing faster. She hadn't run. She didn't know how. She saw Jon, and her mouth moved, and no sound at all came out of it. Jon had exactly one heartbeat to grasp the whole shape of it. 2 guards standing between Sansa and the gate. Arya already at his side, and a wound in his ribs, robbing him of breath, and the numbers against them swelling with every moment that passed. He could cut his way through to Sansa, or he could hold the gate open for Arya. In the time he had left, he could not be certain of doing both, and the choice, whichever way it broke, was going to cost him something he could never get back. He chose both. Some part of John had known all along he was always going to choose both, whatever it cost him, because leaving a sister behind was not a thing his father's son had ever learned how to do. Sansa! He was moving before the word was even out. Sansa, look at me. You have to come with me. Now. She didn't move. That was the terrible thing about Sansa in that moment. She wasn't being stubborn. She was drowning. She had just watched something inside that castle. Her whole gentle education had left her utterly unarmed against, and her body had simply stopped working. She looked at Jon, the half-brother she had spent months arranging never to be seen beside, the bastard whose name she'd allowed to embarrass her in front of Joffrey's bright, cruel little circle. And even now, even here, Jon watched the old reflex flicker across her face. Flee with him, or stay and pray Joffrey's mercy reached further than anyone drawing breath had reason to believe. Jon, it came out very small. My father, where is my Sansa? He had no time left to be gentle, and so he wasn't. There's no mercy coming, not from him, not for any of us. Come now, or you die here. She still didn't move, and so Jon made the choice for her. He crossed the last of the yard, seized her by the wrist, and pulled. Hard enough to hurt, hard enough to crack whatever had frozen her in place, and dragged her stumbling toward the low door in the yard's far wall that Arya was already hauling open. Not the main gate, the servants' way, the narrow route down through the Red Keep's lower levels that Arya knew by heart from 100 stolen afternoons spent chasing cats through the underbelly of a castle no high-born girl was ever meant to know at all. The gold cloaks hadn't covered it. Why would they have? It was a servant's passage, dark and mean and forgettable, and the men running the coup had gone straight for the grand exits a lord would use. They had not once reckoned on a bastard who'd spent months being dragged through the servants' world by a small girl who flatly refused to stay where she was put. Down they went, the three of them, through the dark and the damp and the smell of old cooking gone cold. Arya leading by memory and touch, Jon with one arm hard around Sansa and the other hand never leaving his sword, counting the turnings, listening behind them for boots on stone. Twice they heard men moving in the passages above their heads. Twice Arya folded them into a sideway Jon would never have found on his own. A servant's shortcut worn smooth by generations of feet that had carried trays instead of blades. Behind them, a shout went up. They had been marked, but the door was already swinging shut, and the dark was already swallowing them. And for the length of that passage, at least, they were only 3 shadows the hunt had not yet caught. The postern gate at the bottom still stood unbarred. Barely. They spilled out into a stinking alley behind the kitchens, just as a guard moved to seal it, and John put his shoulder into the man and shoved his sisters through the closing gap and out. And then they were in the city, the vast, roaring, wholly indifferent city, with the wall of the Red Keep rising black and torchlit at their backs. John looked back once. Somewhere behind that wall, his father was still inside it. Alive, most likely. Cersei would want him alive a while yet for the use of him. A prisoner, possibly by morning, something far worse. And there was nothing, not his sword, not his training, not the whole of everything he had become in this city, that John could do about any of it. Nothing at all, except the 2 girls breathing hard beside him in the dark. He turned his back on the walls that held his father, because it was the one thing left that his father would have asked of him, and understood that saving the family he could still reach meant abandoning the one he couldn't, and that he was going to have to live with the cold arithmetic of that for the rest of his days. The city was a wound, and everything in it was bleeding toward the gates. John led them down into it, not toward the main roads, which were already thick with gold cloaks, stopping anyone who looked as though they might be running, and everyone was running, but into the crooked capillary streets Arya had spent months teaching him, without either of them ever knowing it was a lesson. The fish market, the tanner's lane that everyone avoided for the reek of it, the worn steps down toward Flea Bottom, where the highborn never set foot, and the searchers therefore thought to look last. He kept Sansa's hood pulled low, and Arya's hand locked in his, and moved the way Barristan had taught him to move, through a room full of danger. Unhurried, unremarkable, a face that gave a watcher no reason to hold on it. Twice they passed a patrol. Twice John's hand stayed well off his sword, and his eyes stayed down. And twice the patrol found nothing worth the stopping in 3 tired travelers among 10,000. The blade at his hip could save them in a corner. Out here, in the open, it was the knot drawing it that was keeping all 3 of them alive. His side ached with every stride, the bound wound pulling hot and tight beneath his shirt, and he did not let a whisper of it show in how he walked. A man who limps through a crowd is a man a searcher remembers. So he walked easy and breathed slow, and privately hated every step of the pace that costume cost him. It was in the long shadow of the Gate of the Gods that the luck he hadn't earned finally found him. A knot of men were forming up beneath a black banner. Rough men, hard
guardmen, a few boys in chains among them, and at their head a stooped, sour old crow of a man in worn black was cursing the crowd out of his path. John knew the black when he saw it. The Night's Watch. Recruiters, bound north with whatever scrapings of the city's jails and gutters they could carry off before the walls sealed. You're one of Stark's. Not a question. The old man's eyes went over the three of them, the wounded boy, the two girls, one of whom was plainly no servant born, and something hard and disgusted settled into them. Saw what they did in the square, saw the whole rotten business of it. He spat into the mud. Yoren. And you're a great fool to be standing out here in the open with those two. He jerked his chin toward his ragged column. Get in, middle of the pack. Say nothing to no one. John didn't ask why. You do not question the one hand the gods trouble themselves to offer. They cut Arya's hair with Yoren's own knife in the lee of a wagon. She didn't cry about it, which somehow made it worse. She only held very still and watched the dark locks fall into the mud and became, in a few rough strokes, a scrawny boy bound for the wall like any other in the string. Sansa they buried in a plain servant's cloak, hood drawn low, her soft hands tucked away out of sight, her chin down against her chest. John walked at the column's edge, with his wound bound tight beneath his shirt, and his sword wrapped in sacking like a recruit's poor scrap of kit. And in the great heaving press at the gate of the gods, where the gold cloaks were stopping lords and merchants, and anyone whose fear looked as though it might turn a profit, and had no patience left over for a crow's sorry string of gutter rats. They walked out, straight through the middle of it,
beneath all notice, because the coup had taught the whole city to run at once, and 3 more runners in a recruiter's train were nothing worth a second glance. One gold cloak did look, once, straight at John, and held it a long, flat beat too long. John met the man's eye with the dull, tired, empty face of someone too poor to be worth the robbing, and let his gaze slide off without interest. And after a moment that stretched much too far, the cloak grunted and shoved the next traveler forward. John did not let himself breathe until the gate was well behind them. The walls fell away behind them into the gathering dusk, and for the first time since the sound had reached him across the training yard, John let himself draw a full breath and let himself think one single thought past the next 30 seconds. Of the North, and of Robb, and of a home he had not laid eyes on in half a year, before the true size of what waited there settled over him like a cold that no fire was ever going to reach. The King's Road ran north through a country only just learning it was at war. John watched his 2 sisters survive it in 2 different ways, and both of them frightened him. Arya hardened. That was the only honest word for it. The girl who had begged him for sword lessons on the ride south had watched men die and had killed to keep breathing, and something in her had closed over the wound of it far too fast and far too clean. She slept light now. She watched the tree line.
She kept her stolen knife where her hand could find it in the dark. And when John caught her eye across the low fire, there was a flat, grown watchfulness in it that no child of her years had any business owning. It kept her alive. It also kept him lying awake, wondering what it was going to cost her later, when the running finally stopped and there was quiet enough to feel it. Sansa broke the other way and leaned. In King's Landing, she would have died before letting a bastard see her weep. On the road, she wept where he could see her, and let him steady her over the rough ground, and asked him, actually asked him, her, Sansa, whether he thought they would truly make it home. She had spent months keeping a careful, embarrassed distance between them. That distance was simply gone now, burned clean away in a single afternoon, and what was left in its place was a frightened girl and the brother who had pulled her out of the fire. They were not the same as they had been at Winterfell, either of them, and Jon knew it already. Whatever came after, whatever home they were riding toward, he was bringing back two sisters who had been remade by the space of a single afternoon, and he did not yet know how he was going to tell Robb that the girls coming north were not quite the girls who had gone south. News came the way news always came on a road, in fragments, from strangers, half of it plainly wrong, but the shape of it firmed up mile by mile, and the shape of it was this: the North had risen. Robb had called the banners, every last one of them, and the lords who had knelt to his father were riding to him in their thousands, cold and furious and grieving. The Riverlands were up. The Trident was mustering. A war had begun, a real one. The whole gray weight of the North and the rivers tipping south at once. And Jon rode along the edge of it and felt a thing he had never in his life felt before, that it was his, that he was inside it, that the wall, whatever else it might one day have given him, would have made him a spectator to the fate of his own blood. And instead, here he was, riding straight into the middle of that fate, and no man living could ever again tell him it was not his to fight. The crossroads came on a gray afternoon, and their paths were meant to part there, Yoren's crows bearing on north toward the wall, Jon and the girls breaking east and north, for wherever Robb's great host had reached by now. They never got the chance to say the goodbyes. A rider came up the southern road at a full gallop, mud to the withers, shouting his news out ahead of him, the way men do
when the news is too large to hold behind their teeth. Half the crossroads heard it at once. John heard it, standing with a hand on his horse's neck, Arya at his hip, and Sansa a half step behind his shoulder. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Hand of the King, named traitor, and taken out onto the steps of the great sept of Baelor, before the whole roaring city, and there, in front of every last one of them, put to the sword. Sansa made a sound Jon would never afterward forget. Arya went completely, terribly still, and Jon stood in the middle of the road, with the whole world gone silent and roaring at once, and understood that the man who had brought him south, instead of sending him to the wall, the father who had, at the very last, chosen him out loud, was dead now on a southern scaffold, his head struck from his shoulders before a cheering crowd, and that whatever Jon Snow had believed himself to be riding toward an hour ago, he was riding toward something else entirely now. Robb's host had swallowed a river valley whole.
Jon smelled it long before he saw it. Wood smoke and horse, and the churned reek of 10,000 men camped in the mud. And then they came over a low rise, and there it was, a gray sea of tents and banners spread out beneath a bruised northern sky, more of the north gathered in one place than Jon had ever laid eyes on in his life. They found Robb in the largest of the tents, bent over a map, older than the boy Jon had left at Winterfell by more years than the months between could possibly account for. He looked up. For 1 second he was only Robb, and then he saw the girls behind Jon, Arya's shorn head, Sansa's hollowed eyes, both of them alive, both of them here. And the king in the north came around the table and had his sisters in his arms before a single man in the tent could think to bow. He wept, and did not try to hide it, not from them. Jon looked away to give him the room to do it. Grief for a father just confirmed death, and relief for 2 sisters he had long since counted among the lost, all of it at once. And when Robb finally drew back and gripped Jon's arm hard, there was something in his face past gratitude, something like a man who has been drowning a long while and has just felt ground beneath his feet. "You got them out." Robb's voice was raw. Word came that the whole household was dead. Every rider said the same thing. He stopped and started over. "You got them out." "I had help," Jon said, "and more luck than I earned." "You had a sword and the sense to use it well." Robb's grip tightened. Around them the tent was full of gray-haired lords who had been running his war, and Jon could feel every one of them taking his measure. Robb felt it too. "Half my bannermen have never held a command in a real fight in their lives. I've got courage, and I've got numbers, and I've got not one man who's actually done the thing." He looked at Jon the way a man looks at a tool he badly needs, appearing suddenly in his own hand. "You have." It moved faster after that than Jon could quite believe. By the end of the week, he had a command. Not a large one, a vanguard, a few hundred horses, but a true one, given on the strength of 2 things no man in that camp could argue with. He had trained under Barristan Selmy and Jaime Lannister both,
which not one other soul in the host could say. And he had carried 2 high-born girls out of a burning capital with a wound in his side, and never once let them fall. Loyalty of that kind could not be taught into a man. The lords understood it plainly, even when they disliked the shape of the one it had settled on. And they did dislike it, at first. Jon heard the muttering wherever he went. Ned Stark's bastard, handed men to lead. The very words he'd heard his whole life, in the very same tone. He argued with none of it.
He had learned long ago that a bastard never wins the argument about what he is. He only outlives it. So he threw himself into the cold, grinding work of the thing, and let the muttering close one mouth at a time. The Lannister foraging column caught him testing that new reputation for the first time, and nearly ended it. It was a richer prize than his scouts had promised, better guarded, and Jon's first true engagement as a commander almost became his last. He'd meant to take them in the open, cavalry from the tree line, quick and clean. But the Lannister captain was no fool. He had thrown out a screen of crossbows, and the first charge broke apart against it, and for a few terrible heartbeats, Jon watched his own men going down into the mud around him, and understood, with a sick lurch, that he had misjudged the whole of it. A quarrel took his horse out from under.
He hit the ground hard, the old wound in his ribs screaming. A Lannister man-at-arms already standing over him, with an axe swinging down. He got his blade up on instinct alone, turned the blow, rolled, came up inside the man's reach and killed him, and stood there, gasping in the middle of a fight that was sliding away. And then he saw the thing his plan had not. The crossbows had come forward off the road to break his charge, and in coming forward, they had left the wagons behind them all but bare. A rider who went wide and around could take the whole column from the flank while it was still busy congratulating itself. There was no time to send it down a chain of command. Jon simply took the nearest 20 riders himself, swung wide through the soft ground, and hit them from the one side they had stopped watching. It broke them. The cleverness was never in the plan. The plan had failed. It was in reading a losing field in the space of a single breath, and finding the one move that turned it, the way Barristan had taught him to read a room. Only this room was on fire, and full of men trying to kill him. By dusk the column was taken and the wagons were Robb's. It cost 30 of his 300, and Jon learned every one of their names before he slept, because his father would have. That night the most seasoned commanders in the host spoke of him quietly around their fires, and the word one old knight let slip, half to himself, careful, the way you don't speak lightly of a green boy in his first season, was a name out of the old histories. And far to the south, in a city he would never fully hold, a soft round man heard the first faint whisper of a bastard general winning battles he had no business winning, and sat very still, and began to reconsider exactly when a certain sealed letter might stop being merely dangerous and start being useful. The whispers reached Varys, the way all whispers reached Varys, early, and from 3 separate directions at once. He weighed them the way he weighed everything, not by who had won or lost a given field, but by what the winning meant for the one thing he had ever truly served. Not a king, not a house, but the realm itself, and the small folk in it, and whether they would eat come winter, or die
in another great lord's quarrel. And what the whispers told him, turned over long enough in the dark of his chambers, was this: the bastard was not merely a good sword. Good swords were common as mud, and the war was fairly drowning in them. This one had something far rarer, the thing that made hard men follow him into places good sense said to stay clear of, the thing that ended wars instead of feeding them. And if the letter folded away in Varys's keeping told the truth, if Eddard Stark's plain, careful hand had set down what Varys had long half suspected it might, then the boy winning battles in the north was no bastard at all. He was very nearly the one thing the bleeding, fracturing realm might actually need to stop its bleeding. A claimant with a bloodline old enough to command loyalty, and a record earned in the field rather than inherited squalling from a cradle. Varys did not love Jon Snow. Varys did not, he'd have told you, permit himself the luxury of loving anyone. His work could not afford the expense. But he had spent his whole strange life in service of a single, patient question. Which of all the men grasping at that ugly iron chair would leave the smallest heap of corpses behind him? And for the first time in a great many years, he thought he might be looking at an answer to it. The trouble was the letter's provenance.
If he simply produced the thing. Here, my lords, the true birth of your bastard general, which I happen to have been sitting upon since a little before Lord Stark's head parted from his shoulders, then every man in that camp would ask the obvious question. Why had the Master of Whisperers kept such a secret to himself, and in whose service? The answer would cost him more than the letter was worth. A secret revealed by the man who hoarded it is forever suspected of being a weapon. A secret that seems to arrive on its own 2 feet is believed. So Varys did the thing he had always done best. He built the letter a road to travel with no name upon it anywhere. It left King's Landing in one set of hands, and changed to another somewhere on the King's Road, and changed again at a Riverlands inn, until by the time it turned north toward Robb Stark's camp, not one man in the whole chain could have told you where it had truly begun, only that he'd been paid, and paid well, by someone he would never see twice, to carry a sealed thing north and ask no questions of it. And he timed its arrival the way a careful man sets a single stone rolling down a chosen slope. Not too early, while it was merely a curiosity to be doubted. He waited until the War Council had another matter entirely upon its table, until the first serious rumors had reached them of something stirring in the Far East. A name rose out of the ash of a burned dynasty, gathering strength across the narrow sea. Let the letter land, Varys thought. At the precise hour its meaning would weigh the most.
It reached Robb's camp on a wet gray evening, carried by a tired rider who wanted only to be paid and gone. He knew nothing worth knowing. Paid in King's Landing, he said, by a party he never rightly saw, to see the letter safe into the hands of the king in the north. He'd done it, He'd like his supper now, if it was all the same to their lordships. Rob turned the thing over and over in his hands. It was sealed with plain gray wax, unstamped, giving nothing away. But the direction written on the front was in a hand Rob had watched sign 100 documents in the solar at Winterfell. A hand he would have known blind, in the dark, by the feel of the strokes alone. His father's hand, careful and plain and utterly unmistakable, reaching up at him out of a southern grave. For a long moment he could not move. Whatever this was, his father had written it, and his father was dead, and that made it the last thing Eddard Stark would ever say to him in this world. He very nearly broke the seal where he stood. Then something in the weight of it stopped his hand. Some instinct that a thing written in secret, unsigned, unsealed, with such care taken to hide its road, was not a thing a man should read alone. He set it down. He called for the one person he trusted with anything that truly mattered. "Find John," he told the guard at the flap. "Bring him, now, before I open this." John came in from the rain with mud to the knee and found his brother standing over a letter he would not touch. "It's from Father." Rob didn't look up. His hand, I'd stake my life on it. When he finally raised his eyes, there was something almost frightened in them, which John had never once seen on Rob in all their lives. It came without a name on it. Whatever it is, he took pains to keep it hard to find. "I'm not opening it without you standing here." So John took his place at his brother's shoulder in the lamplight, and Rob broke the gray seal and unfolded the last words Eddard Stark had ever set to paper. They read it together in silence, and the world came quietly apart around them. It had been written, the letter said, in the last uncertain hours before the king's death. A man putting his affairs in order, who suspected he might not be given the time to speak them aloud. And what it set down in Ned's plain and careful hand was the single truth he had carried for 14 years without ever once letting it past his teeth: that John was not his son, that John was no man's bastard at all, that in a tower in the red mountains of Dorne, at the bitter end of a war, Lyanna Stark had died with her brother's hand in hers, begging him to protect her newborn child. A child got not on some camp follower in a soldier's idle season, but by Rhaegar Targaryen himself, that the boy was true-born,
that Ned had smuggled him north and buried his true name beneath a lie and worn the shame of a bastard he had never sired for 14 long years, for one reason and one reason only, because a mad king's grandson, once discovered, would not have lived out a single season, and a dead man's unwanted bastard was the very safest thing in all the world to be. John read it once, then he read it again, then a third time, because the words would not hold still on the page. He kept waiting for the relief to come. That was what he'd have expected had anyone ever thought to ask him. That learning he was no bastard, that he had a name and a place and a claim after all, would land like a door swinging open after a whole lifetime spent shivering outside it. It didn't. What came instead was a grief so total and so strange he had no shape to put it in.
Because every cold look of Catelyn's, every "my lord" he had never been permitted to soften into father, every hour of being made to feel less than the boys he'd been raised beside, all of it had been a wall Ned built on purpose, stone by patient stone, to keep him breathing. His father had spent 14 years letting him believe himself worth less than he was, and had swallowed a lie about his own honor to do it, and had never once been able to tell him why. Your mother was a woman I loved. I'll tell you the rest when it's safe. It had never been safe. It still wasn't. And Ned had died before the word ever came, and left it here in ink instead. And John stood in a war tent in the rain and grieved, not for the father he had lost, but for the one he had never once been allowed to have. Robb had gone very quiet beside him. He was looking at John the way a man looks at something he was certain he understood, and abruptly doesn't. Not with suspicion, not with fear, but with a slow, dawning recalculation moving plain behind his eyes. His brother, his cousin, his blood, in a way more direct than either of them had known when they woke that morning. And something else besides, something that Robb, king in the north, crowned by lords who were bleeding and dying for his cause, could not now unseen, no matter how he tried. Do you understand what this is? Robb said. It was not quite a question. It's father's grief, John said. That's all it is. It changes nothing about what it's a claim. Robb's voice had gone strange and quiet and terribly certain. A real one. Older than mine. Older than Robert ever was. He set the letter down with great care, as though it might go off in his hands. I've asked the North to bleed for a crown on my own head. Thousands of them. For a king in the North who only ever wanted to break away and let the rest of the realm burn behind him. He looked up at John, and John watched the decision arrive fully formed, the way all of Robb's decisions always did, all at once and immovable. There's a better claim standing in my tent tonight, a truer one that isn't about splitting the realm in two. It's about who ought to sit the whole of it.
He drew a slow breath. I'll not spend these men on my crown any longer, Jon. I mean to spend them on yours. And outside the tent, in the steady rain, the war council was already gathering to be told. The lords came in out of the wet, grumbling and half-armored, and Robb told them without preamble that the war they had been fighting had just changed its whole purpose. They didn't believe it at first. Then they didn't like it. The great Jon's voice filled the tent to its seams. He had crowned Robb with his own 2 hands, had roared for the king in the north first and loudest of any man there, and now his king stood before him, saying it had all been for the wrong Stark? Others took it up around him. A bastard. They had bled for a true son of Winterfell, and were now to bend the knee to Ned Stark's bye-blow on the word of a dead man's letter with no seal upon it? It could be a forgery. It could be a Lannister trick to sow rot in their own ranks. It could be 100 uglier things before ever. It was a Targaryen prince hiding in the vanguard they'd been cheering for a fortnight. Robb let them shout themselves thin. When the noise finally guttered, he did the thing his father had taught him without once meaning to teach it. He laid the facts down flat on the table and let them do the arguing for him.
The letter was Ned's hand. Half the men in this tent had seen enough of Ned's writing over the years to know it was true. The claim, if it held, was older and cleaner than any left standing in the whole bleeding realm. And as for the man himself, here Robb turned it on them like a blade drawn slowly. They had all been watching him for weeks. The boy who had carried 2 high-born girls out of a burning King's Landing. The commander who had broken a Lannister column that outnumbered him and then learned every dead man's name before he'd let himself sleep. They had been calling him a legend around their own cook fires only nights ago. Were they now going to stand and tell their king that legend wasn't fit to lead them? The tent went quiet in a different manner then. It was the quiet of hard, practical men recalculating. The very same cold northern pragmatism that had crowned Robb in the first place, turning now, slow and grudging, toward the man standing at his side.
Jon had heard enough of it. I never asked for this. He said it to Robb, but the whole tent caught it. For any of it. I don't... He stopped and began again, plainer. I've spent my whole life being told exactly how much of everything was never mine. My name wasn't mine. My own father wasn't mine to call father. A seat, a future, a claim to anything at all. None of it. You don't spend 14 years learning you have no right to a single thing and then decide in one afternoon in the rain that you want the largest claim there is. He shook his head. I don't know how to want this. I'm not even certain that I do. I know that. Robb didn't argue with the feeling. He never had, with Jon. And that's the very reason it ought to be you. He stepped in close and dropped his voice until it was only the 2 of them in that crowded tent. Every other man reaching for that throne wants it. Cersei wants it. Stannis wants it.
Every last one of them wants it badly enough to burn the realm to ash before they let it go. You're the only claimant I have ever heard of who doesn't. That isn't a weakness, John. Right now, tonight, it might be the one thing that makes you safe to hand it to. The messenger came before John could find an answer. He shouldered past the guards, travel-stained and urgent, and the news he carried had come a very long way indeed. Riverlands traders, a Bravosi ship, port gossip carried inland from mouth to mouth until it grew teeth. A name was moving across the eastern edge of the world. A Targaryen. A princess. The last of Aerys's line by every account any man in Westeros had ever heard, gathering men and ships to her across the narrow sea. And the wilder tellings, the ones the messenger repeated in the careful, flat voice of a man who does not expect to be believed, said she had brought back into the world a thing no living soul had seen in 150 years.
A thing that came out of fire. Robb heard it and understood all at once that the thing he'd set loose in this tent an hour ago had already grown far past the borders of the north. John's claim was not a northern cause any longer. It was about to become the single question that decided everything. Because the realm did not have one Targaryen rising up out of the ashes of the old war. It had two. The news of the Dragon Girl changed the shape of every plan on the table, and Robb, who had spent a hard week learning to think past his own crown, was the first man in the tent to see exactly how. He sent riders east before the week was out, not with a declaration. That was the thing his lords kept bracing for and kept being caught out by. A king in the north does not, by any custom anyone could name, write letters of friendship to Targaryens. But Robb was no longer writing as a king clutching a crown to his head. He was writing as a man who held a piece on the board that not one of his rivals knew existed. The message he sent across the narrow sea, through as many careful hands as it took to get there, said a thing no one in living memory had said aloud to House Targaryen. That a true-born heir of their line had been found, alive, raised in secret in the cold north, under the eye of the very man who had died to keep him hidden. Blooded now in a real war, and loyal, and here, and that the North offered not a rival claim to be fought over, but a shared one to be joined, against the Lannisters who had murdered both their fathers. Fight one another for a broken throne, the letter said, in all but words, and the Lannisters win the realm entirely, while two dragons squabble over ash. Or find the way to stand together and end them. Jon watched his brother build the thing, and slowly began to grasp the shape of it. He had spent days resenting all of it, the claim, the weight, the crown no one had thought to ask him whether he wanted. But watching Robb work, watching the riders go out, and the whole war redraw itself around a purpose larger than any one house's vengeance, something in Jon quietly shifted.
This was not a war for the Starks any longer. It was not even truly a war for a throne. Robb was reaching for the one thing no man in 300 years had managed to hold. An end to the realm tearing itself to pieces every time a king died without a clean heir to follow him. 5 kings had risen out of Robert's death, each of them certain, each of them willing to feed thousands into the fire to prove that certainty. Robb was trying to stop it, with a claim clean enough and a claimant reluctant enough that men might rally to it rather than bleed each other white over it. If it held. If a Targaryen princess with fire at her back and a Targaryen prince with the North's steel behind him could somehow learn to trust one another before ever they stood in the same room. It was a thin and half-mad hope, but Jon had watched his father die for an honor that changed nothing in the end, and this, for the first time in his life, felt like an honor that just might. They broke camp beneath a new banner. It went up on a gray morning as the host formed to march south again, and men stopped where they stood in the mud to look at it, because not one of them had ever seen it. The direwolf of Stark, running full out, and behind it, wings spread wide, the 3-headed dragon of a house the realm had spent 15 years pretending it had finished for good. The 2 of them together on a single field, for the first time since before the rebellion, since before Rhaegar and Lyanna, since before the lie that had made Jon Snow, and the truth that was now about to unmake him. Jon sat his horse beneath it and looked south, toward a war that had grown immeasurably larger in the span of a single letter read by lamplight. Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, whoever he was meant to become now, and he did not yet know, and the not knowing sat in him like a second wound that would not close. His father was dead on a southern scaffold. His brother had given away a crown to set it on his head. Somewhere across the sea, a woman he had never met was calling fire up out of the ashes of the same burned dynasty, and might one day greet him as kin or as rival, and no soul alive could say which it would be. The family that had spent his whole childhood pretending it had not fully claimed him had, at the very last, claimed him completely. And it had done so, Jon understood, staring down the long gray road south, at the exact moment that being claimed had stopped being safe for a single person who stood anywhere near him. The horns sounded down the line. The great host shuddered and began to move, and beneath the wolf and the dragon both, Jon Snow turned his horse south and rode toward the rest of the war. Stood, staring down the long gray road south, at the exact moment that being claimed had stopped being safe for a single person who stood anywhere near him. The horns sounded down the line. The great host shuddered and began to move, and beneath the wolf and the dragon both, Jon Snow turned his horse south and rode toward the rest of the war.